Hey YouTube, so today I'll be making this recipe called Boston brown bread. It's got a really rich history. I've been wanting to try this recipe for a while, but I'm going to give it a water bath canning twist. Traditionally, it is pretty much water bath canned in cans, coffee cans. So I'm going to go ahead and use my mason jars and can the bread. It's going to be quadruple the recipe of what I found online, and that way I'll be able to hopefully get 8 mini breads in these pint jars here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put these jars in the oven to give them a sterilization at 300 degrees for about 20 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I'm gonna prepare the bread batter. This recipe doesn't require yeast. It's going to have baking soda in place of it. For the dry ingredients, it's 2 cups of flour. Now I'm gonna just use this organic white unbleached flour. So 2 cups. Two cups of rye flour. Rye flour is really good. It's high in fiber. Now I had my rye in the form of rye flakes and I just ground it up into flour. But any way will do. Any form will do as long as it at the end of the day is flour. So 2 cups of rye flour. 2 cups of corn flour. I have a video I'll link in the comment section showing how easily you can make your own corn flour. But either way, corn flour. 2 teaspoons of baking soda. And 2 teaspoons of salt. So now for the wet ingredients. This recipe calls for 4 cups of buttermilk and 2 cups of molasses. Now, I like molasses, but I feel like that's way too much molasses for me. So I am going to half that 2 cups of molasses down into 1. And now, because I've taken away 1 cup of liquid from the molasses that should have been in the recipe, I will add that cup in buttermilk. So instead of 4 cups of buttermilk, I will do 5 cups of buttermilk. And instead of 2 cups of molasses, I will add 1 cup of molasses. So I don't actually use true buttermilk. What I do is I take 1 cup of whole milk and I add 1 tablespoon of vinegar, and that will create a thicker milk, which is a very good substitute for buttermilk. And I find it works perfectly fine. I'm just going to go ahead and add the 4 cups to my dry mix. So the milk's been added. I'm just going to mix this in and then add the molasses. Okay, so I've added the milk and now I'm adding the molasses, 1 cup. And this reminds me of, I don't know if you've heard the saying, slow like molasses in January. Where the saying slow like molasses in January comes from is because there was an event that happened in January. In 1919, actually, it was called the Great Molasses Flood, which is pretty insane because a big tower with thousands of liters of molasses collapsed completely in the middle of Boston. And it actually, if it wasn't so sad, it'd be kind of funny because molasses was smelling in that part of the town of Boston for decades after this event. It was a pretty horrendous event because like over 20 people died. So that's where, and if you can think about how molasses is really, really thick, it happened on not a really, really cold day, but by the next day, the temperatures had kind of gotten low, and it made it really hard for rescue efforts because it's not just a flood, it's a flood of molasses covering everything. So that's it's a pretty crazy event that happened, but it was the molasses flood that happened in January that saying, slow like molasses in January, comes from. Okay, so we've got this mixed in. As you can see, this is not going to be like your regular bread dough. It's really liquidy. I'm just going to use my measuring cup here to scoop the right proportions into each mason jar. I'll come back once I've set up my jars. Okay, so you can see I've filled these jars just a little over half full, and that gave me my 8. And you can see inside I scooped out a little bit on these ones so that I could even it out on this side. But at the end of the day, all the batter has been divided into 8 glass jars, and I'm going to go ahead and wipe them off with this vinegar rag and put the lids on. And then I'm going to go ahead and put them in the water bath. Now, this is a bit of a different way. The traditional way to make Boston brown bread is to submerge it in a couple of inches of water. So the water level is only going to be about 2 or 3 inches from the bottom. And you could do that 2 ways, either in a pan on the stove or in a pot on the stove. I'm going to use my water bath canner. Or you could do it in a pan in the oven. As long as the pan has enough room to have about 2-3 inches of water in the bottom, you could do it that way too, because it was traditionally done with coffee cans, and then the lid, in place of a lid, they just put aluminum foil over the top while it cooks up. So I'm going to go ahead and get these jars ready for the water bath canner. Okay, so all these lids have been sterilized in hot boiling water, and now I'm just screwing the rims on, finger tight. And they're going in the water bath canner. The water is at about 3 inches high. And so as you can see here, it's not like the usual where the water level is up to the neck or above even, depending on which method you use for your water bath canning. For the Boston brown bread, the level is actually much lower. It's only 2 to 3 inches of water depth. So I measured and I have about 2.5 inches. As long as this level doesn't go below 2 inches, I'm going to keep it at that and just let it slow simmer. It doesn't need to be at a rolling boil or anything like that for you to start your timer. As long as it's simmering, that's basically when you start your time, and you let it simmer for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So anywhere from 2 hours and 15 minutes to 2.5 hours is fine. And it's just going to slow cook with the water in the bottom of the pot. I'm just going to put my lid on to help keep the heat contained inside of the jars, but I'll come back in 2 hours and 15 minutes and I'll show you what they look like. So this is what it looks like right after I've let it cool down completely in the pot and took it out. I never ended up actually needing to refill that water bath canner with more water. It stayed at pretty much the same level for the whole 2 hours and 15 minutes. So really, I guess you could just add some boiling kettle water if you do run out, but because I put the lid on, it seemed to have kept most of the moisture and water inside the pot for the whole time. So this is what it looks like. You can see that it is right up at the top. So the level that I filled it at was just right. So here's the jar. I'm just opening it with like the non-sharp side of the butter knife. Not that butter knives are sharp, but you know, the side that's less sharp. And just lift up on the jar. So you can see it was right up to the rim. So I got it as close as I've ever got it before. Normally I get it where there's like a good space of air, but I actually got what I would call a full loaf of bread in this one. So what you're going to do is, some recipes call for you to butter around the edges, and I don't think that's necessary, because if you just take a butter knife and gently scrape it around the sides of the jar, it will come loose that way just by running it around the edges of the bread and then just tipping it. It should pop right out. There. So I'm going to go ahead and just slice this warm. You see that? Okay, so you can see what this slice looks like. It's soft and tender, so I'm just going to make a few slices. I like the shape when they're in circles. Okay, so I'm just gonna butter it and I'll give a taste test. Okay, so it's buttered and I'm gonna get my daughter to taste test it for us here. Good? Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna taste it. Yeah, very good. If you can get the rye, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea to get the rye. You can do the recipe without the rye flour, but I feel like the rye flour adds a nice flavor profile to the recipe. So if you can get the rye flour, it's a good idea, I think. So that's it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. I just wanted to add this one thought about making the Boston bread or other breads. In the future, I'll be making a how to water bath can bread video, but for making the Boston brown bread, you're going to need a wide mouth jar. As you can see, this jar has no shoulder to it. It's just straight down, and the opening goes all the way down, and there's no edges on it going in. And this is the only type of jar that you can use when you're making that type of bread, because when you want to cut out the bread, it will fall out this way. This pint jar, on the other hand, has a shoulder to it, you see? And so when you're trying to get the bread out, it won't come out, it'll get stuck. So the only pint jar that you can use for canning bread is a wide mouth pint jar.